Good morning, church. I hope that you are feeling good this morning, excited to be here on this beautiful day, and we've enjoyed some beautiful weather lately, and we thank God for that. And we're excited to be together today, and we are entering into the second week of a study that's going to take us through a series of events that starts in Acts 3, and we're going to go into Acts 4 as well. But we're going to be in Acts 3, beginning verse 11 here in just a few minutes. So if you got a Bible, want to turn there, it'll be on your screen as well. Every single effect has a cause. You see, nothing just happens. Everything has a reason that it happens. I was reminded of this just about a week and a half ago. I was driving, and my brakes, they started making noise about 2 weeks prior. And I immediately ordered some brakes off Amazon. I was going to put them on myself, as I always intend to start. Every man can tell you this. There's a billboard on the sign. It's a company logo that we repair what your husband fixed, right? So I always start that I'm going to fix it, and so I ordered my brakes, and a week went by, and they were making some noise, and I said, well, I've got to get those. And this last weekend was the weekend I had pinpointed I was going to do it. Well, as we were leaving the parking lot, last Wednesday night, I hear clunk, clunk. I said, that's not good. That doesn't sound like brake problems, but sure enough, my brake pad had actually fallen out of my Jeep. I didn't know that could happen, but it can happen. Trust me, it happened. So I had to have it towed and all this, and I got to thinking there was an effect, but there was most definitely a cause, and the cause was I wasn't as quick getting to the repair as I should have, and because of that I had to do additional repairs because it not only messed up the brake pad, it messed up other pieces, and here I am, and every effect has a cause. When we were leaving, I'd finally got it fixed. I had it towed to a friend. When we were leaving there, Mandy drove me over to get my Jeep, and on the way there, we realized the air conditioner in her van just wasn't working right, something not right. And by the time we got there, it wasn't working at all. And we had to go on this search, and luckily I've got a good friend who's a mechanic, and we had the first person that checked it said it was going to be a $1,000 compressor repair, and the second person, the guy that I know, got to look, and it was a $25 part. And I like $25 a whole lot better than $1,000. Be careful, get you a mechanic. If you can find a good mechanic, hug them, kiss them, love them, make them your best friend. But, he had to go on a search. There was an effect. The air wasn't working. He had to go and he had to dissect. He had to figure out what was the cause of that. Why wasn't the air working? You see, every effect has a cause, and we understand this in what we do in life. We understand that the way things pan out, ultimately, we may not understand every way in every situation what the cause was. Sometimes we'll say it just happened. I don't know what caused it. But just because we don't know doesn't deny the fact that every single effect that we see has a cause. When you leave here today and you get in your car, you're going to see you're going to be in a machine. If you're in a car, you're going to be in a machine that you can see has design and structure. There's an effect, and it just didn't happen, but rather engineering minds had to get together, and they had to put it together, and they had to piece it together, and you're going to understand that this effect, the effect that I have a car as I drive, that had a cause, somebody put it there. And you're going to drive by trees, and you're going to drive by nature, and you're going to understand that those trees give air and oxygen so that you breathe, and you couldn't breathe if not for those trees, that there is an effect, that there is something I see, and something had to have caused that. We understand the concept that every effect has a cause. Last week we started in Acts 3. In Acts 3 we see a man who was over 40 years old at the point that we picked up his story. And he was there, and he was outside. He was at the gate called Beautiful, and there at that gate he said each day somebody would carry him to the gate, and there he would sit and he would beg for alms. He would beg for someone to help him because he was poor and needy and he had no way to help himself. And we saw at the end of that story that Peter and John had come along, two friends who had spent their life and probably grown up together. They had started a fishing business together, and they come by and they heal this man And when we left off last week, he was going to church. He wasn't just going, he was going to church. Amen? Y'all are not ready to go to church the way he was going to church, obviously. He was going to church. He was shouting. He was jumping. He was praising God because his over 40-year problem was now solved. It was wiped away in just an instant like that. The day he woke up that morning, he had no intentions of doing anything but hoping that some people would give him some money that day. But when the people saw him, they became witnesses to what God had done. We talked about the concept of being witnesses. We're not necessarily witnesses to when God, for instance, we see nature and we see how God created everything, and we're witnesses to the effect. We're not always witnesses to the cause. And in this particular instance, we don't see a picture where a whole lot of people saw the cause. We see people, though, that saw an effect. They saw that this man who they had known their whole life to be a beggar was healed. And they said, that's the effect. Now, what caused this? Why did this happen? Because that just doesn't happen. A man who was crippled from birth doesn't just suddenly decide that he's going to be okay, and he gets up and he starts not just barely wobbling along. No, he's jumping up and down, he's shouting, he's praising. And they see with their own eyes that there's an effect. And they say, what caused that? Now we who believe, who are Christians, who have already come to faith, whether or not you're in that category or not, I don't know. But we believe that there was a great effect, that the reason we understand nature and the reason things were created was that there was one who designed it and put it into motion. We believe that there was a historically verifiable person named Jesus Christ. And he came, and we can go back and we can use the same kinds of documentation that many in the world would view, and we can verify that there indeed was a man named Jesus, and that he walked here on this earth. And we can verify through various means that he was not only walked on this earth, but he died on a cross. And we can verify through traditional means, the same way we would be able to verify anything historically, we can verify that Jesus rose from the dead. Now that should cause us to go to church. And this morning, we're going to talk and wrap our minds. Last week we talked about the results of faith. That faith is not necessarily being able to see, but it's not blind. Sometimes we mistake faith and blind faith. We're not talking about blind faith. We're talking about faith. It means we examine the evidence, and after we see the evidence, we believe. Well, these people who saw this man leaping and jumping, and they knew something had caused this, and they wanted to know the effect. And so ultimately, we have what we call an audience. You got their attention. Peter and John are there, and they have the attention of everybody that surrounds them in Acts 3. And they're going to do what we need to do as Christians. And they immediately begin to point back to the primary point of faith. Because if we miss this point of faith, we miss everything. Joseph Worthland puts it this way. He says, the resurrection is at the core of our belief as Christians. Without it, our faith is meaningless. Christians, if we're wrong about this thing, we're wrong about everything. And therefore, it is of primary first importance that we understand and we have faith and we have a belief in this thing, or nothing else will matter after this thing. That's true in 2019. It was true in 33. It was true in 30. Whatever year we're talking about just after the death of Jesus, when Jesus goes to a cross. And now remember, the church has just been established. We're just a few weeks after Jesus has been indeed resurrected. And the primary point of emphasis in the apostles' teaching in those first days was that Jesus is risen from the dead. And so Peter's going to begin what we know as the second sermon that we have recorded in history. The first one is in Acts 2 and Acts 3 as a result of this miracle that they have seen, and they're asking the question, what caused that? Well, Peter's going to answer their question. And he's going to answer that question in a beautiful sermon that we're going to spend the next few weeks going through. We're going to start verse 11 today, Acts 3, verse 11, if you would read with me. While the man held on to Peter and John, all the people stood there, and they were astonished. And they came running to them in the place called Solomon's Colonnade. The people were, as you and I would be, they were astonished at the amazing way in which this man had been healed. And they are in what we know as Solomon's porch or his colonnade. It's just outside. If just a little bit background about the temple and the way it was designed. Solomon's colonnade would have been a very wide and long porch, is the closest thing that we could call to. It would have provided some shelter from the weather. And as you would go in the temple, you would go, as you got closer and closer to the middle of the temple, ultimately you get to the Holy of Holies, there was this hierarchy of where you could go. So just past Solomon's colonnade, you've got the courtyard of the Gentiles. So Gentiles even could go into this. And so we're in an area in Solomon's colonnade that anybody would have had access to. That's why we just saw an area here. Why was the beggar outside the temple? Well, beggars, crippled, would have been considered unclean. They couldn't have went any further into the temple, but they would have been in the general area where the Gentiles could have went as well. And so he's here, he's begging, and Peter and John get everybody's attention now because they see this man and they are filled with wonder, and they want to know the same thing you would want to know if you were sitting there that day. What caused this? How did this happen? And so they're here in this place called Solomon's Colonnade, and they have the audience, and Peter begins his sermon in verse number 12. When Peter saw this, he said to them, fellow Israelites. He's speaking to a primary Jewish audience. Even though this would have been an area that the Gentiles could have went, he's speaking primarily, as would have been most of the time the case, to an Israelite Jewish audience. He says, why does this surprise you? To us, that sounds kind of silly, right? Why does this surprise you? I've seen this man sitting here at this gate for 30-something years begging, and he's crippled, and now he's no longer crippled, he's running, and he's jumping, and he's hanging on your arms, and he's just so happy. Why does that surprise me? What Peter's doing is he's pointing out that this stuff has already been happening. You just haven't been looking for it. The effect has been everywhere around you. You just haven't seen it because you have not opened your eyes. He says, why does this surprise you? Why do you stare at us as if by our own power or our own godliness we had made this man walk? He reminds them that inherent in us is no power. If I do anything good in my life, it's only because God allowed me to do that good. It's only because God worked through me to do that good. I'm not good or godly enough to heal anybody. I'm not good or godly enough to teach anybody. No, it's God working through me. And he reminds them, listen, it may look like we healed this person. That may be your first instinct. But you've seen me and you've seen him. We're just people like you. Why are you surprised? Why would you even think that maybe we were the cause of this? Peter does a great job of deflecting attention back to where the attention should be. It should be a lesson to anybody that serves in churches. It should be a lesson to anybody that leads churches. It should be a lesson to anybody that sits in a church. That when somebody begins to dote on you and praise on you, to remind yourself that you are simply a vessel, the same way Peter was a vessel, and any good you do is just simply a fact. It's simply that you got out of the way and allowed God to work. And we must have the same kind of humility Peter has here. And he brings that to their attention. Listen, don't get focused in on us, because it would be easy to get focused in on them. To be honest, if Peter walked in this morning and somehow we were able to know that it was actually Peter, nobody's going to listen to me anymore, okay? We're going to pay attention to Peter because he's seen some things, he's done some things, and they see Peter seemingly has done some things. And so it would be natural for them to say, maybe you're a god. They're hunting the effect. They're hunting the cause of the effect. Peter says, listen, don't get hung up on us. Don't be deceived. We are not the cause of the effect. He continues, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified His servant Jesus. You handed him over to be killed, and you disowned him before Pilate, though he had decided to let him go. There are many things we can focus on when we think about the story of Jesus, but Peter's talking to an audience. He knows his audience, and he starts by focusing on first that Jesus was Jewish. That's important, especially in this story. He wants the people to understand that hey, I'm Peter, I've got the same roots that you do, and this Jesus that once was walking around here not very long ago, he was Jewish the same way that you're Jewish. You understand that God uses a Jewish man in the Jewish origin, and He sent him, and He assigns guilt. He says, you handed him over to be killed. Now, even in our English Bibles, we might not recognize this quite as well as we should. But if you get into some of the study of this, you'll understand that Peter is evoking some thought back to some Old Testament passages. Isaiah 51, Isaiah 52, where we read about the suffering servant that is Jesus, that Jesus would ultimately become a servant, but He would have to suffer this cruel death on the cross. And while we don't hear it that way, we don't immediately click, oh, Isaiah 51, 52, the original audience would have. And they would have connected that He's connecting Jesus to Jewish blood, and He's connecting Jesus to Jewish Scripture. And He's verifying through them, He's giving them facts about Jesus. And, Pilate, he wanted to let Him go, but He's not letting them off the hook. You handed Him over, and you disowned Him before Pilate. He's laying the blame solidly at their feet. And then he goes on to define Jesus a little bit more. He says, you disowned the Holy One. You disowned the Righteous One. And instead, you asked for a murderer to be released to you. Jesus reminds them not only in their exuberance, in their over-the-top mentality, this mob mentality that took over when Jesus was crucified. Not only did you become a murderer, you released a murderer in order to murder. He's laying the blame solidly at their feet. There's no Jew that could have heard this that wouldn't have been convicted or insulted, one of the two. And here they are, and Peter is giving it to them. Continue verse 15. You killed, and I love this, the author of life. The one who is the ultimate cause. You see, when we put together our story about how all this happened, and we as Christians verify for ourselves what we believe and what we come to faith in, we understand that God became flesh, and that He was fully man and fully God, and He was ultimately the author of all life. All life, backwards and forwards, filters through and goes through this person, Jesus. And He says, don't mistake it. You killed the author of life. You killed God. But, a very important but God raised Him from the dead. And now, what are we? We are witnesses to this. Now, in this, and He's going to continue on, and we're going to go through the rest of this. We're going to stop here in this text this morning. But he immediately puts the primary first thing, the first thing that has to be established in order for someone to believe, to become a believer, is they have to believe in the resurrection of Jesus the Christ. And we could spend literally hours going through all the ways in which we can prove as Christians that there indeed was a resurrection. We could look, and we're not going to do that today, but some of the things we could look at the radically changed way in which these apostles, they go into the story of Jesus, and they're scared, and they're timid, and they're running away from Him at the cross. And then every single one, really, I like to make the argument that we're pretty sure almost all of them died a martyr's death. Now, some will say, well, John was out there, he was exiled on Patmos, living on an island in prison. That's pretty much being martyred, okay? Nearly all of them went, and guess how many of them recanted their story about Jesus? Now, people will lie for nothing. You know that in your life. But when they got a gun pointed at their head, suddenly that's a truth serum, right? Suddenly they'll start telling the truth, and they'll tell things that they wouldn't have ever believed that they would have told, because we have something in us, life, because we are products of the author of life, and we have an inherent thing in us that wants to protect that life. And so we understand that all these apostles who were scaredy cats running away at the cross when Jesus was put on the cross, and we see them in the upper room right after, and what are they doing? They're not sitting around waiting on Jesus to come back. They're sitting around weeping. They're scared. They're frightened. Am I next? But instead we see them go out and they boldly proclaim, and they boldly go to prison. They boldly go to death for what they believe. Guys, something had to happen for that to happen. We could look at the fact that though it was so desired for there to be a body found, there was no body found. There's never even been a hint through history that they found the body of Jesus. You can go to this day to the tomb of Muhammad. His body is there. You cannot on this day go to the tomb of Jesus and find a body, because that body has never been found. There's never been a hint. There's never been a sniff of it. Why? Is it because nobody thought to look? Let me tell you something. When the revolt started, when the Jews and ultimately the Romans thought that there was going to be this upsurge of Christians, and they were worried about this uprising, if there was a body to be produced, let me promise you it would have been produced. But there is no body. We have eyewitness testimony that the grave cloth, that Jesus didn't just stumble out of that grave, but He was miraculously pulled out of that grave, because the grave clothes that He would have been wrapped in would just merely fell flat. That's the image that the Gospels teach us. He didn't just somehow, suddenly, as some have suggested through time, after being hung on a cross for several hours, 3 days later, regain the strength and just kind of hobbled out of the tomb and maybe rolled away the stone all by Himself. In what power, I don't understand. But no, we see verifiable evidence that tomb was empty and those clothes lay flat. We can not only believe, we can study evidence, and we can see that the resurrection took place. There are hundreds of witnesses who saw Jesus after. Many of them we have a record of in our Bible, in literature. The Bible is a historical document. It's not merely a historical document. We who are Christians believe it's much more than that. But it is a historical document. And thus, when we have historical documents, we check out the veracity of them. We try to see if they're true. And we see multiple accounts in this historical document about people who saw Jesus walking around after He died. And my friends, He was fully human, but He was fully God. We don't see the resurrected Jesus today, but we have evidence of the resurrected Jesus today. We have the effect, and we have to ask, what is the cause? And the cause ultimately can only be described this way: but God. God had to work. God had to take action. He had to step down into history. Now, Paul, in 1 Corinthians, he's writing a rather scathing letter to the church at Corinth. And to be honest, let's just be honest, if if Corinth had a Church of Christ name on the building today, we would say they were no longer a church. God still considered them a church, but we would have said, nah, not us. That's not us. They're no longer a church. They were pretty messed up. There's a lot of bad things going on. It should remind us to let God decide that, right? Ultimately, they were in a really bad shape, and Paul's trying to clean up their mess. And he's trying to point them back and say, listen, you've got all these issues. But towards the end of his letter, he reminds them of something I want to remind us of. 1 Corinthians 15, beginning in verse 1, going through verse 4. 1 Corinthians 15, beginning in verse 1, going through verse 4. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel. What is the gospel? What is the good news? I want to remind you of the gospel that I preached to you, which you received, and on which you have taken your stand. He's telling them the effect is here. There's a church that's established. He's reminding them that there was a cause to that. He said, I want to remind you about the cause. Don't forget the cause. By this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain. If you miss this, you've missed it, Paul says. He said, for what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. This is primary. If you miss everything else, you're better off having this fact in your arsenal come Judgment Day. You need to know this thing. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that He was buried, and that He was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And then he continues to go on, and he talks there about all of the ways in which there was witnesses to this. Here's the reality. If there is no resurrection, we have no hope of resurrection. Everything hinges on the resurrection. The wonder of the resurrection is this. Go ahead and go to the next slide here. The wonder of the resurrection lies in this. One, it happened. We can see the effect, and ultimately the only cause that we can make explanation of it is God. And the beautiful thing is that it happened for me. In Romans chapter 6, there Paul's talking, and he reminds us that we are, at baptism are joined with a death like His, and that because of that we will surely be joined in a resurrection like His. The beautiful thing about the story of the resurrection is that as we come to faith in it, we can make that story our story. And Paul wanted to remind you, and Peter over and over and over again reminds you that the first thing you have to understand, the one thing you have to understand, the only thing you have to understand before you can become a Christ follower is that there was a man named Jesus, that He died on a cross, and that 3 days later He walked out. And if we can know that, if we can believe that, we know the core, we know the value, and on this day you can make that story your story. That's what Paul tells us in Romans 6, that we are buried with Him through baptism so that we can have a resurrection like His. Because if there is no hope of resurrection, if Jesus was not resurrected, we're not going to be resurrected. But we don't believe blindly. We believe that there's evidence that Jesus truly was resurrected, and that story can become our story. And that is the beauty of how Peter begins this address to these people. We're going to see how it continues in the coming weeks. Let's pray together. Our Father and our God, we praise You as our God. We love You. We honor You. We bow before You as unworthy people, knowing that for so many people that sit in this audience today, Your story has indeed become our story, that we have been buried not because of our own worth or our own godliness, but our own goodness, but rather because of Your godliness and Your goodness. Your story is our story. And we went through a death, a baptism, so to speak, and on that day we died to ourselves, and we rose, and we now will have hope, and we have assurance, and we can know that we have the resurrection. The resurrection is ours, and we praise You as our God for that very statement. God, let this day be the day that someone else who understands and believes in the resurrection says, today I'm going to make that story my story. And I'm going to walk into the waters of baptism, and I'm going to rise up new and refreshed, so that one day, when this world and the hurt and the pain in it ends, and you reconcile all things, that on that day, they will truly understand, they will truly know that Jesus indeed was you, that Jesus indeed was flesh, that Jesus indeed went to that cross, and that He rose again. We praise you, we praise you, we praise you. Soften our hearts. Make our hearts more like yours. In Jesus, through Jesus, and because of Jesus, the church offers this prayer. And the church together says, Amen. Today, make His story your story. Or if you're struggling with any part of your faith and you need the support of brothers and sisters around you, we want to stand as that vessel. We want to allow God to use us to support you and lift you up. If you have any need of a spiritual nature, let us help you while we stand and sing.